Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our IASP PRF webinar. I'm Renee Chassie, IASP's Publications Manager, and today we are excited to bring you a webinar produced by IASP's Abdominal and Pelvic Pain Special Interest Group, titled Trainee Forum for Enhancing Success in Basic and Translational Pain Research. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Daniel J. Claw from the University of Michigan in the US, Dr. Michael Gold from the University of Pittsburgh in the US, Dr. Katie Vincent from the University of Oxford in the UK, and Dr. Kevin Hellman from Endeavor Health and the Pritzker School of Medicine in Chicago in the US. IASP, PRF, and the Special Interest Group are thankful for everyone who could join us today and remind you that today's webinar will be recorded and available for later viewing at IASP's Pain Education Resource Center. I'd also like to encourage our viewers to utilize Zoom's Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have during today's proceedings. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kevin Hellman. Kevin Hellman joined the North Shore University Health System and created the Gynecological Research Laboratory. His expertise in basic pain research, computational analytical methods, paradigms for studying spontaneous pain, and the science of electrophysiology was essential for the development of robust assessment of the physiological basis for pelvic pain. He is also the principal investigator of an NIH-funded grant that studies the physiology and treatment of women's health conditions. With that, I'd like to pass today's proceedings over to Kevin, and I look forward to hearing from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. There was a request at the last IAPSIG meeting for the Abdominal Pelvic Pain Group for a trainee symposium. I'm delighted to provide advice from 3 scientists who conduct abdominal and pelvic pain research that has broad relevance for all pain researchers here at IASP, particularly trainees. We will first listen to their personal stories, and then we will have a panel discussion where you, the audience, can submit questions on aspects relevant for the development of your own personal careers. I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Katie Vincent, a professor at Oxford who leads the Pain in Women Research Group, focusing on mechanisms generating and maintaining chronic pain, particularly in women. Dr. Vincent's research focuses on the unique and often overlooked burden of chronic pain in women, particularly conditions like endometriosis, dysmenorrhea, and bladder pain syndrome. Notably, she was one of the pioneers in the field before me. In addition to her research, Dr. Vincent is a passionate and skilled clinician at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. She leads a multidisciplinary pelvic pain clinics and adolescent gynecology clinics, delivering compassionate, patient-centered care to women and teenagers. Importantly, she has also brought several trainees into this underdeveloped area, both in research and clinical practice. Dr. Vincent exemplifies an ideal mentor and advocate, combining her research and clinical care expertise with a deep commitment to advancing our understanding and of solutions for pain in women. Thank you, Katie. You can speak now.
Thank you, Kevin, for that really kind introduction. So Kevin asked me to talk a little bit about my journey into research. So I started off as a general clinical trainee. As is common in the UK, I went straight from school to medical school and was very clear that I wanted my career to be in women's health. And I had a pretty clear idea which bits of women's health interested me. I always wanted to be a clinician, not a researcher, but I always had a bit of an interest in the research side of things. And at that time, you still needed a higher degree to enter subspecialty training. So if you wanted to be anything more than a generalist, you needed a higher degree. So I did a few extra things. I did an extra year of basic science in the middle of my medical degree, and I entered some prize competitions, essays, extra exams that were useful revision anyway. And that's about all I had on my CV until I found the opportunity to do a DPhil. And my DPhil, at the time I went into it, felt very much as a means to an end, a way of getting some extra clinical expertise, because it allowed me to work in a pelvic pain clinic at the same time as studying for a higher degree. It allowed me to open my door to sort of higher clinical training. And also at that time, I really hated public speaking. So I was going to push myself to make myself do something that I knew was going to be essential for my career, even as a pure clinician. And I have to say that I absolutely hated the first year of my PhD. So I went from being a relatively senior clinician, running labour wards with consultants at home, delivering emergency gynae care, operating on my own, to suddenly feeling like the complete idiot who couldn't hardly turn the computer on, let alone run any of the technical programs. I didn't understand the language people were talking in the brain imaging centre that I was working in. And I was really quite miserable at the beginning. And I got through that by having really excellent supervisors who really supported me. Irene Tracy, I'm sure all of you know, and Jane Moore, who was my clinical supervisor and I worked very closely with, and then Stephen Kennedy. So I had 3 really good supervisors who offered me lots of emotional support as well as the sort of practical means to get through my DPhil. We also had a fairly large group. Irene had a lot of students at that time and a lot of postdocs. So there were people sort of more at my peer level to offer support as well, which I think is valuable at that point. But by the time I was halfway through my second year, I realized that actually I didn't want to go back to full-time clinical practice, that what I really liked was doing the 2 things together, being able to maintain my clinical skills. But actually, there was such a huge gap in knowledge in pelvic pain, and so few people at that time seemed interested in it. I'd go to EFIC meetings, IAS meetings, and hardly anyone had anything to do with women's health, anything to do with hormones, anything to do with endometriosis, for example, was a really small area. And I realized there was such an opportunity to really make a difference to the evidence we used in clinical practice. And so I was able to secure a clinical lectureship straight out of my DPhil. So those at that time were funded by the NIHR in the UK, and that allowed me to train 50-50. So it did double the length of time it took me to complete my clinical training, but allowed me half time to keep going with my research. So I came out, I started my clinical lectureship, and fairly quickly after that, I had my first baby. I then did my final clinical exams, and then I had another baby. So actually, I spent quite a lot of those first few years as a postdoc doing other things whilst trying to maintain a bit of my research. I managed to publish 2 papers from my DPhil really quite easily without too many negative reviews. And I felt quite positive about publication, and I didn't realize quite what the barriers could be, which is certainly not what I've seen sort of subsequently. And then I realized that I was running out of time with my funded research time, and I was told to go for quite a senior fellowship to fund me going forwards. And I think in retrospect, that was probably bad advice, and I should have gone for something of a bit of a lower level that would have maybe given me less money or a shorter time period, but would have had a higher chance of success. The NIHR fellowships that I was going for, I'm sure are quite similar to NIH and other fellowships. They're a huge amount of work to get 3 to 5 years of personal funding, and you put all of your plans and all of your effort into them for 6 to 12 months while you prepare that. And to then get rejected was my sort of first experience of rejection, and I found it quite challenging to get beyond that, and also to feel I'd wasted so much of that final year of my academic training post. And I then applied again a second time round because I was told I'd got very close to getting funded, so it was worth putting in a second application. And the second time round, I didn't even get through the shortlisting because my publication record wasn't strong enough, because I'd published nothing over that last year because I'd been completing my clinical training and writing a fellowship application. So I found all of that really quite a knock. And I then put a third fellowship application into a different scheme, which was also not successful. And people were saying to me, maybe you need to be starting to think about just getting a full-time clinical role. Maybe you're not cut out for research. This is not a good time. And it was quite a challenging time. And again, I was trying to finish off my training, try to get some papers written, look after my children, who at that point were at nursery and school, so bringing home every bug going. And it felt like we spent lots of time sort of dealing with those challenges as well. And then I was really, really lucky that a really large collaborative grant came up. I was supported within my department to be the person that led the application for that. And that was successful and funded both my time for 4 years, but also funded me to do a program of research that was really what I wanted to do, and to support, as Kevin mentioned, to support PhD students and postdocs through that. And once you do get a big chunk of funding, I think then it's much easier to get more funding because people can see that you've been successful at delivering from one bit. So you suddenly go from looking like someone who's not really been able to deliver very much to someone who can manage a project, who can deliver. And so subsequent to that, I've certainly had plenty of grants been rejected, but I've continued to manage to bring grants in. Lots of our papers we found challenging to get published, but I think some of that is that we're going against sort of standard messages. So if we're thinking in the context of endometriosis, for example, we're talking more about pain approaches rather than surgical approaches. That goes against lots of people's clinical practice, lots of people's earnings, the way that they make their living. So actually it's beholden on us to conduct some really good research before we argue against people's clinical practice. But I think initially I used to take those rejections very personally, but now I realize that actually, there are really good reasons why people don't like hearing things that are different to the norm. And as there are more and more groups starting to work in this field and more of us producing similar work, I think it's much easier to get those sort of slightly different views accepted. So I think if I think about what are the things that I would say that were helpful for me or that I would recommend in the future, I think having really good mentors. I've already mentioned my 3 PhD students, PhD supervisors. When I was right at my final year of my PhD, there was an IASP conference in Glasgow that had a SIG meeting prior to it, and I had the opportunity to meet some people that were leading the SIG and leading it in that field who were incredibly supportive. So Andrew Baranowski and John Hughes both really took me under their wing, encouraged me to apply to be on the committee of the SIG, and encouraged us to put workshops in with other more junior people, and really offered a lot of support, and I really value what they offered to us. I think resilience, everybody knows that grant applications get rejected. I think people maybe don't hear the negatives. So I think people assume that everybody who's successful was successful in everything they did, rather than lots of our papers go around 4 or 5 journals before they get accepted, or that lots of our grants get rejected. So you really do have to go in expecting that. I think pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones, as I said, I didn't like public speaking. I didn't particularly like going to meetings and not knowing anyone and having to sort of make an effort to network. But actually, I've made really good collaborations, but I've also met people that I would absolutely consider as friends rather than just collaborators and colleagues, and people that I now enjoy going to a conference because I know I'll get the opportunity to go out for dinner with someone that I really enjoy spending time with. And I think looking after our juniors, Kevin already mentioned that that's something that I think is important, but I think if you get a good PhD student or a good postdoc, they are worth us investing in, both to look after their own well-being, because we remember how tricky it was for ourselves, but also because they're the people that are really delivering the work. I don't do very much of the actual research myself. I write grants and sort of plan things, but the actual day-to-day data collection, data analysis is mainly done by our group, so they deserve us to provide that time. And Kevin, I think you also said for me to sort of think a little about the challenges of balancing clinical work and academia, and that's certainly very difficult. And I think in the sort of post-COVID world, at least in the UK, it's increasingly challenging because our clinical services are under-resourced, so we're being pulled all the time to do more clinical work. But on the other hand, I think continuing to see patients on a regular basis reminds me why I do the things that I do, encourages me to write grant applications about questions that really feel very relevant to me, because I see day to day the challenges that the patients face. So for me, at least, I wouldn't want to drop either side of it. I think the two sides are really complementary.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And maybe I'll eventually learn not to take my rejection so personally. It sounds like there might be hope. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Gold, professor of neurobiology at the University of Pittsburgh and a leader in the understanding of neurobiology of pain. Throughout his distinguished career, Dr. Gold has made groundbreaking contributions, including elucidating injury-induced plasticity and nociceptive afferents, and their role in persistent pain. His innovative work spans isolated cell studies, the development of novel behavioral assays, and investigations into clinical populations. Dr. Gold's mentorship is equally as remarkable as his scientific achievements. He is the quintessential mentor who guides his mentees through the complexities of research and inspires them to think critically, ask meaningful questions, and strive for excellence. I first crossed paths with him when he was an editor and I was writing up my work on descending modulation. His advice was valuable for me, and I've noticed he also provides remarkable support for trainees in the field. As a paragon of mentorship, he offered numerous opportunities in his roles at the International Association for the Study of Pain and as founding president of the United States Association for the Study of Pain. Thank you, Michael. You can speak now.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, and hello, everybody. It's interesting sort of following Katie's perspective or trajectory. Mine was very different. I'm here in the US. The traditional sort of academic trajectory for those of us in the US is you go through grade school into high school, apply to college, which is generally 4 years, and then on to a more specialty, either MD, PhD, or PhD program. And I didn't do the traditional trajectory. I took a year off between high school and college, much to the dismay of my parents. I ended up taking another year off in the middle of college. Took a year off after college before starting graduate school. I started working in a laboratory during that first year off in the middle of college. Going into college, that first year off, I did construction and was for at least the first couple of years of college thinking that architecture would be my lifetime pursuit. But you know, you tend to gravitate towards the things that come easily, and for me, research and sort of the biological basis of behavior, which is something I had been always curious about, sort of drew me in and was just easier than the architecture courses I was taking, which had me up all night, multiple nights in a row. And the work in the research lab during that year off in the middle of college sort of convinced me that research might be the way to go. I continued to work in a laboratory during that year off between graduate school and between college and graduate school, and was finally convinced. And so I'm a full supporter of people who take their time and make sure that this is something they want to do. I think in graduate school, having had that time and perspective, it enabled me to be much more focused in what I was doing, the courses I was taking, and I could really bear down on, if you will, trying to find what I call the sort of level of analysis, if you will, that you're comfortable with. I started with these big questions like the sort of neural basis of behavior, and through just a series of experiments and trying different things in the laboratory, ultimately ended up with patch clamp electrophysiology, finding that the ability to describe the parameters of a channel opening and closing with, you know, an R² value of 0.998 was a level of resolution that felt right to me, felt comfortable. I still am excited to see action potentials when I record from neurons. In terms of the courses or the institutions, I'm from California, was born and raised in Northern California. I was actually born at University of California, San Francisco, went to college at UC Berkeley, went to graduate school at UCLA, back to UCSF for a postdoc, back to UCLA for a second postdoc. And it wasn't until that second postdoc that I finally left California in my mid-30s for a faculty position in Maryland. And I think the key, and I would sort of mirror what Katie said, at least for me, and what really enabled me to progress, stay in it, put up with the experiments that didn't work and the papers that got rejected and the grants that got rejected, was the series of mentors that I had. In graduate school, it was John Liebeskind, who was a past president of the IASP. He was at the Issaquah meeting and the founding of the IASP. And he really was the one who instilled in me the at least planted the seed anyway of appreciating that sort of the power of the integrated approach to a research problem, that is from a basic science to a clinician. And that's something that I've really taken to heart and was reinforced working with John Levine at UCSF, who's a clinician researcher, still sees patients or saw patients at the time while doing basic research, and would bring to the discussion of basic mechanisms that clinical experience. And being involved in the research group meetings at UCSF with basic researchers like Alan Basbaum, clinician scientists like Howard Fields, clinicians like Mike Robotham, who really covered the full spectrum of perspectives, was really an exciting view, if you will, and really convinced me that that was the type of environment that I wanted to continue to work in. That the two of them really fed off each other. That is, the clinical observations and the basic. Katie can embody that with serving as an MD, PhD the way she does. In somebody like me who's just a PhD, I have to have collaborations, but my collaborations have been really phenomenal. Have really guided the work that I've done. And those mentors, as I said, John Liebeskind, John Levine. My first faculty position was under Ron Dubner. We're all people who were not only able to help guide me in terms of choices that I made, but ultimately served as champions for me to get me out on the stage, to get at least my name in front of other people, so that I had a chance. I was lucky enough to be on the stage of an ISP meeting relatively early in my career, and that was really because the people that were out there, my mentors, were advocating for me. And so I can't emphasize or de-emphasize enough how important that, or it really is emphasizing enough how important having people who will be your champions is for a career. The hard part for people who, I was lucky to sort of fall under the mentorship of a number of wonderful people. And I think a challenge is how to find those people if you are in an institution that maybe doesn't have a big research environment, that doesn't have a lot of people to choose from. And it's, the institutions like the ISP and the USASP, the other pain societies around the world that really provide that avenue, I think, to access mentors. In the USASP, we've got a program of establishing mentor-mentee relationships with people who may not come from institutions that have that sort of built in, if you will. And I think those are opportunities that if you find yourself at a place that doesn't have sort of people to look out for you, that will be your champion, that those sorts of opportunities are ones that I would encourage you to participate in. I think the final just comment I would make in terms of my career trajectory and the sort of power of that sort of integrated approach and the value that I've gotten from my collaborations with my clinical colleagues is that I'm I guess I would call it a person with lived experience. I was a migrainer. I've had postoperative pain that's turned into persistent postoperative pain. I've had pain that has sort of been with me for much of my life. And as much as that has been a problematic issue just simply because of having pain. It has been incredibly useful in guiding how I think about the research that I do, and the kind of questions that I ask in the laboratory. Um, and so access to people who have a lived experience, I think, is also an invaluable component of the process, certainly with what we're doing as pain researchers. And so I would encourage you to pursue that as well.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I miss the prior days of the dopamine rush I would get when I would hear those action potentials over the speaker. Our final speaker, Dr. Daniel Baugh, he's probably the foremost expert on fibromyalgia and still has time to study pelvic pain. Dr. Claw is a professor of anesthesiology, medicine, rheumatology, psychiatry at the University of Michigan, where he also serves as the director of the director of the Chronic Pain and Fatigue Research Center. He has served as dean for research and principal investigator in Michigan's Clinical and Translational Sciences Award. Aside from his obvious mentorship at Michigan and his growing team of pain researchers, I've had the incredible privilege of being mentored by Dr. Claw. His guidance has been instrumental in shaping my own journey as a researcher, guiding research methods, grant writing strategies, and even providing assistance as a co-investigator on key projects. Dr. Claw's mentorship has been a cornerstone of my own professional growth. His generosity with his time, knowledge, and insights embodies what it means to empower the next generation of scientists. Today, Dr. Claw will share his reflections on mentorship, a subject he values and exemplifies daily. Thank you, Dan. You can speak now.
Thanks, Kevin. Good seeing you, Katie and Michael and everyone else. So thanks for asking me to do this. My course is probably a little bit more similar to Katie's than Michael's, but it's actually different yet. So I went to medical school never thinking that I was going to do research or not really being inherently interested in research. My only exposure to research was in a gap year. I worked as a research assistant in a lab that was testing chemotherapy drugs in rats, and I got bit by very large rats, and I learned to hate research. That year was sort of, I made good money, but it wasn't at all anything that I aspired to do going forward. And then after going to medical school at Michigan, I went to Georgetown for my internal medicine training and my rheumatology training. And in the second year of my rheumatology training, I was working in an intensive care unit, moonlighting, trying to make some extra money. And I read an article in the Washington Post, the newspaper, that the state of Minnesota had taken the nutritional supplement L-tryptophan off the market because in their state health department, they had identified a signal that people who were taking tryptophan had very high eosinophil counts. For those of you who are not clinically trained, eosinophil is a certain kind of white blood cell. And when I saw that, we had seen some people at Georgetown clinically that had this really bizarre clinical condition and had very high eosinophil counts. And so I remembered those people's names. There were 4 people that we had seen over the last year and a half or so. I looked in their medical records. There was no indication that they had consumed L-tryptophan, but at that time, no one was telling their physicians about nutritional supplement use or anything like that. So I called those 4 people, and all 4 of those people, in fact, were taking tryptophan, which was unusual at that time. People weren't taking a lot of nutritional supplements at that time. So I went back to our clinical faculty at Georgetown. I asked the people that were practicing in Georgetown, if anyone had seen people with high eosinophil counts. They found another 3 people that they had identified over the last year. And I called all 3 of those people, and sure enough, all of them also were taking L-tryptophan. So the thing that got me hooked on clinical research is that I wrote a case series that was published in JAMA that was the first description of a new disease that ended up being called eosinophilia myalgia syndrome. This was a disease that was caused by tryptophan that ended up being contaminated. inadvertently. And these people, about 15 or 20,000 people in the United States developed this disease. It was pretty horrific, a lot of inflammation, a lot of skin changes. Probably 1,000 or so people died of the disease. After they took what happened is that the company that caused the disease was a large Japanese company, and they funded research on that disease. I didn't know how to do research, but I was one of the world's experts in a new disease. And so I identified people that could help me learn how to do research. Some were from up the street at the NIH and Bethesda, some were at Georgetown. I knew nothing at all about doing research, but I could put teams of people together to try to answer clinical questions. And so I did that with eosinophilia myalgia syndrome. That disease went away. And then I became really fascinated clinically with the condition fibromyalgia, because I was seeing a lot of individuals with fibromyalgia. At that time, no one believed it was a real disease. They thought these were just neurotic middle-aged women. Fortunately, my mentors at Georgetown, even though they were not good, they were not serious researchers, NIH-funded researchers, they actually also believed this was a real disease, fibromyalgia, even though the only article they could give me was an article from the magazine Washingtonian, which is not at all a scientific journal. It is an article about what happens in the Washington, D.C. area. So then I became interested in fibromyalgia, started using some of the money that I had gotten, grant money, to study EMS on studying fibromyalgia. And in 1994, I was invited to give grand rounds in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and I accepted the offer to give grand rounds on fibromyalgia, not knowing that the other speaker for these quarterly grand rounds meetings in Martinsburg, West Virginia, was the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army. And he was talking on the Gulf War syndrome that had just recently begun in veterans of the first deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan. I gave my talk first on fibromyalgia. This general gets up with all these medals and everything, and he says, Dr. Claude just described all of the manifestations that we're seeing in the veterans who are returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and that we're calling Gulf War syndrome. So again, being entrepreneurial, I knew nothing about studying a syndrome like that, but I knew how to come up with good clinical questions, and ended up getting over $25 million in funding from the Department of Defense to study Gulf War syndrome. And we used as a positive control group in our functional imaging studies, our QST studies, fibromyalgia patients, because our hypothesis was that these people really had something wrong with them. And it was akin to fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, those conditions. And so we use quantitative sensory testing, functional brain imaging, and we use the fibromyalgia patients as a positive control group. I'm not sure who would have ever gotten the money from the NIH to do functional imaging in fibromyalgia. Our first studies literally were DoD funding, really, that was intended to figure out what Gulf War illness was, but instead those were the first functional MRI studies that were ever done in conditions like fibromyalgia. From that point forward, my business model has been the same. What I'm really good at doing is putting teams of people together that have different types of sort of scientific expertise, that come from different disciplines to do team science. I joke that I helped invent team science because I went into science before I knew how to do science. So I had to rely on other people in the team. The other thing that I I think was lucky is that I'm inherently a helper person, a nice person, and I love helping other people, and I've become a really good mentor over time. But I think that one of the things that's been most responsible for the success of our group is how much time and effort we put into training and mentoring. And I really think that one of the reasons that our group has been so successful is we have created a culture and an environment where multiple people in our research group are independent and successful while they stay in a center. That actually is not done that commonly. Often there's one person in charge of a center or in charge of a group or whatever. But the culture of our group is that everyone really can become independent and successful if the overall motto is the team, the team, the team, and we're really helping the most junior people on the team, getting them the mentoring and the training that they need, because it's the new people you bring into the team that have all the cool new ideas, all the innovation, all the things. So I didn't start out 30 or 40 years ago saying that it would be a good business model to be a strong mentor, but I've come to conclude that it is a fabulous business model to focus most or all of your attention on the trainees, find really bright, really talented people. And if you help them become successful, your group or your team will become more successful as well.
Thank you. That sounds like a fantastic business model. We're going to open up the panel to questions. We have one already. So as someone working on their PhD, what advice would you give to being successful at receiving grants?
Who wants to start? I'll start. Have good people on your team. I'll keep echoing the team thing, is so make sure that all of the science that you're proposing in the grant, that you have the appropriate expertise in your research team so that you can do that type of science. Be persistent. Both Katie and Michael talked about this. I didn't because they already had, but one of the things that I think all of us do is we show people the NIH catalogs for you very nicely every grant that you've ever submitted in your entire life. And I show all of the trainees all the grants that I haven't received, because the NIH keeps those for you. And so I think it's important to model failure and model perseverance. Getting back up, dusting yourself off, and then writing the resubmission. And again, I do think that it's important to keep innovating. So I think you try to inject fresh new ideas, collaborators, and things like that into your grants as well.
Yeah, if I were just to follow up to add a couple more things, I would say make sure you have as many people as possible. In particular, people who may be tangential or outside of your field, read it before you submit it, and give it to them with enough time that you can change the grant to address concerns. Be willing to read through, or how do I want to say this? To read between the lines of concerns raised. That is, that if somebody has a problem with something, they may not always be so good at and able to clearly articulate what the problem is, but it should be a red flag to you that they had a problem and tried to do the best you can to divine what that might be, and are there ways that you could change the grant to address it. And I guess the third thing I would say is read the instructions and follow them carefully.
And I guess I'd just add to that I think if you can build your grant on work you've already done, then it's going to look much more strong. So having some form of pilot data or having a paper that's already published that then this work builds on, it is much more likely to be successful. But I would also say do something that you really care about and that you feel really passionate about, rather than someone saying to you, oh, this is what I think you should do, but actually it's not what you're really invested in, because it takes hours to write these grants and then you've got to deliver the project afterwards. So it's got to be something that you really think is important.
Thank you. Our next question is how should people go about looking for an ideal postdoc position, a faculty position? How would you recommend people look for new and ideal faculty or postdoc position?
I'll go first again. I think you can learn a lot about people by just doing a PubMed search and look a lot about the environment that you're going into. Look at authorship order, look at the authorship that people who have done training in that group, where they are in authorship. I think one of the best indicators of if is this a group or a person that you want to work with is look at how many people that group has turned out that have become independent and successful themselves. I can think of a lot of really good people in the pain field that I know that I will not out here, who I don't know a single person that worked with them that became independent and successful because they've had a tendency to use their trainees to help them rather than to again, train or mentor that person to become successful themselves. And so, and I think you can tell a lot about an individual or a group by just looking at their history of, again, look at how many people have come out of that mentorship situation and become successful in their own right. I think that's probably the single best indicator of the fact that you're working in a good team or that you're working with a good mentor.
And I guess you could expand on that by talking to the people that are in that team at the moment. So rather than just going to talk to the person that leads the team, talk to their postdocs and their senior PhD students and see whether it feels like an environment you want to work in.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, there's obviously a lot of factors. Where do you want to live? What potential tools do you want to pick up? Where do you see your trajectory going? You'll always find people who said, well, I came to Pittsburgh as an example, and I didn't think I'd be here for more than a year, and here they are, 30 years later. They came and never left. Plans always change, but to the extent that you can formulate a plan, have some ideas about what you'd like to do, and then think strategically about how this next move is going to help you achieve your long-term plan. It certainly helps if you take that strategy in terms of the questions that you ask when you interview with this person. Are they going to be amenable to helping you get to where you want to go? And it helps when you start considering them around the issues that Dan and Katie brought up in terms of, how does this individual work within a team? If you want to do team science, are they going to broaden your network? Are they going to facilitate making connections that again you see in your longer term plan?
Just one other thing to add is don't think of a single team or a single institution providing the entirety of your mentorship. I think, especially these days, it's very common that people are getting mentored from around the country, around the world, and everything like that. And I can't remember the last time someone reached out to me asking if I would help mentor them that I said no. So I think and I suspect the same is true of Michael and Katie, is that, yeah, I mean, at some point your dance card is full and you can't mentor a single additional person. But I think most good mentors find a way to help people and to really be there for the people that they're mentoring. And so don't be bashful and not reach out to the person or the people in your field that are really well thought of, because you might send them an email and they say, sure, of course, I'll set up a Zoom. I'd be happy to talk to you. And if they're not able to help you themselves, often they'll say, I'm not able to, but you should reach out to so and so and so and so. So I think that just be a little bold and again, reach out to people that you think, like might not otherwise answer your email. You might be pleasantly surprised.
Thanks. We have another question. We have a couple more questions. A lot of people at the beginning of their research career feel a lot of uncertainty or worry about the future with respect to the forces like AI and the climate crisis and how it will impact research funding in society at large in the coming decades. Is there a time you felt unsure about the future of your field? And do you have advice for positively envisioning your trajectory in times of uncertainty and creating the future you envision?
Well, I'll spare Dan jumping out in first on this one and take a swing. The short answer for me is yes. I was coming to the end of my PhD. I was looking around at the number of job postings that were out there. We were in a downward swing in terms of funding. This was at the end of the second Reagan presidency. It looked pretty clear that Bush was going to inherit that presidency. Neither of them were certainly big on basic research. And there was this promised retire off, if you will, of a bunch of investigators that had sort of gotten their faculty positions when NIH sort of was first opening its doors in the mid 60s, and that there would be all these opportunities and nobody was retiring. And so I'm thinking, well, geez, what am I going to do? I grew up in a research family where the industry was always viewed as a dark force, and so I couldn't even consider industry as an alternative, at least if I wanted to speak to my father again. And so I was concerned and thought, well, maybe I'll go get an MD as well as a fallback if I can't, keep doing this research thing. And actually took some courses about, I had a couple of requisites I hadn't taken that I would have needed as a pre-med. Took those and was all preparing for the MCAT and decided, when I sort of envisioned my life as an MD, that I had decided not to be an MD originally because I didn't want to become an MD, and that I enjoyed research enough that I was convinced I could at least find a way to keep doing it. If I worked hard enough, and I've always been someone who's been willing to work hard, and just kept at it, and I guess I've been lucky since because I apparently worked hard enough and kept at it, and so yeah, I was definitely questioning the future. It may not seem at that time as bleak as it currently seems now, but I would argue at that time it seemed pretty bleak. And for those of you, many of you may be too young to remember, but the first year of Reagan's presidency, he stopped all NIH funding. And so there was actually no grants funded in the US through the NIH in the first year that Reagan took office. And that had certainly a significant, if not chilling, effect on those thinking about careers. And yet, the right across the hall from me, or across the wall from me, is a fellow whose grant was suspended, but he stuck with it and has played out a very productive career.
And I guess I would echo those thoughts. So I've already said that, I had quite a bleak period at the end of my clinical lectureship, and I already had that backup of having the clinical option to fall back on. But actually, I'd taken a really scenic route to get to the end of my clinical training. And if I envisaged myself being a jobbing obs-and-gynae consultant, that was not the career I wanted. I'd made an active choice to go into a very subspecialized area of gynecology, and the idea of working 5-6 days a week doing general obs and gynae every day just really didn't appeal to me. And so I was prepared to take the risk that I might not have any funding for my academic time for a while, and that I would have to find ways around that. Also, everybody said that women's pain was an area that no one was ever going to be interested in, and actually certainly within the UK, the change in the landscape of focus on women's health broadly, but women's pain specifically, I think has been huge. We've seen specific NIHR calls with a targeted focus on endometriosis associated pain over the last few years that I don't think anyone would have ever predicted. So I would say being persistent and staying focused on what you really want to do.
And just one of the benefits of getting old is you become sort of a historian. There have been so many existential threats where we as scientists in the biomedical research enterprise over the last 30 or so years have thought the sky was falling, and the sky doesn't fall. And so, maybe that can happen in the future, but of all the careers that I think are going to potentially be taken over by AI and things like that, I don't see science in danger. I think that I think you have to think creatively. I think there's a lot of things about what we do in science that are far less likely to be taken over by some of these technologies than again, more mundane tasks. So I just charge forward. And if you don't succeed in science, the skills you attain in science will serve you well. You become a good communicator. You become good at analytics. You become organized at managing programs and things like that. So it's some of these skills are very transferable if indeed the sky does start to fall.
Thanks. Here's our next question. I'm currently seeing more PhD students and researchers on social media platforms. How do you all feel about using social media to disseminate research findings, connect with other researchers, collaborators, and recruit participants?
Well, I'll say there that it's definitely not my thing. But this is another of the advantages of juniors in your team. So my postdocs are fantastic at social media, and particularly the sort of studies that we're doing at the moment with teenagers, for example, it's a brilliant way to recruit. And I would say we need to be using those tools to disseminate good information, because there's so much misinformation out there on social media that not so much about communicating with our peers, but communicating with the sort of wider public and ensuring the information that is out there is accurate. But I don't think that I'm the person to do that. So that is very much a job that I'll delegate.
Me
Yeah,
too.
my own feeling is I've got a real approach avoidance for it. That the misinformation, disinformation that Katie described, that's been well documented. Science ran a really great piece on it, and who's accessing and spreading misinformation, and how, at least in my view, antithetical sort of the misinformation machine is to what we do, sort of makes me not want to participate. I guess the other thing that creates avoidance for me is the idea that the papers that get seen now and get cited and get the buzz built around them have a social media machine behind them, and it is no longer then about the impact of the data. It's how well the machine worked to publicize the paper. And I'm clearly old school in feeling that the data should really speak for itself. And if you made a really impactful observation, then people will pay attention. Clearly, we're not living in a world where that's happening at the moment. The approach side of it is that it is part of how I keep up on literature nowadays. People posting about papers, and I see them and read them. For political reasons, I made choices not to participate in some platforms, and at least at the moment, there are other platforms that appear to be reasonable alternatives.
Okay, so after this, we'll have one more question. So besides looking at contacts through published journals, is there a written forum to find researchers in a particular field?
Well, if it's pain, the ISP has the SIGs, and the SIGs are a great way of seeing, we've now got the the forum. You can contact these individuals. You can reach out to them. The ISP has done a great job in sort of facilitating those kind of connections. In other fields, I'm not aware of the avenues of finding them or where there are clear lists, but the ISP with the network that they put together around the SIGs, US ASP's got a similar mechanism as well. I think work well in the pain field.
And this is something I just went to a presentation earlier today on AI, and this is something where I think some of the AI search engines, in addition to the classic things like PubMed, can be very helpful in just identifying things that maybe you haven't seen that you want to make sure. But just going to ChatGPT or OpenAI and saying, what are the best citations for this topic or this topic, have them write something and see what they cite, and just make sure that you've seen all the articles that are cited, and if not, go and read them. But it does, I think that some of these, I think this is one of the appropriate uses for AI right now in science, that you can find things that would otherwise be difficult to find, for example, on PubMed.
Thank you. I'll put out one last question. Aside from the IASP meeting, which happens every 2 years, what other meetings should trainees or junior faculty be attending in pain research to really get exposure and to meet important collaborators and identify new opportunities in their field?
So I guess I would say that you don't just have to go to pain meetings. So thinking sort of more broadly about your topic, is there a disease specifically that you're interested in, or are you interested in neuroinflammation? Would you be better going to an inflammatory meeting? Would you be better going to, a gut-focused meeting, as well as thinking about going to pain meetings? So thinking about the sort of collaborative networks that you might need to deliver your future work.
The other training for that I think is just really important for people that are PhD trained is, we call this clinical immersion, but for any of our PhDs, whatever disease they're studying, we have them go to case conferences and clinical conferences so that they can just hear clinicians talk the talk. Again, they're not trying to learn how to become a physician, but you want to just be able to communicate with other people. You want to understand what the biggest problems are in the field. And if PhD trained people don't have those really good clinical collaborators, or those people, they don't do good science, because they don't know like where the problems are that they should be focusing their basic science on.
I'll make a plug on behalf of Dr. Gold for the United States Association for the Study of Pain. They're having a meeting in, is it April? Yeah, so
Yes.
that's been
Starts
at
April
least
30th. Yep.
a remarkable opportunity for me, at least for American researchers. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I hope this has been a valuable opportunity for the trainees. It's certainly been an interesting and enjoyable experience for me. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks.
Good seeing everybody.
Thanks, everyone. We've now come to the conclusion of our webinar, Trainee Forum for Enhancing Success in Basic and Translational Pain Research. I want to thank once again Dan, Michael, Katie, and Kevin for being here today, as well as Drs. Tanya DiRenna, Alec Mamberg, and Gregory Carbonetti for their help coordinating this event. As a reminder, the recording of today's webinar will be available on IASP's Pain Education Resource Center, and we encourage all of our IASP members to explore the other offerings available there. Please consider joining us again this Friday on the 24th of January for our next webinar titled Diminishing Opioid Reward Without Losing Analgesia, a conversation with Francis S. Lee and Richard A. Friedman. featuring discussion on Dr. Lee's recent research findings and the impact of effective science communication. Thank you all for your participation today. Take care and all the best.